The cherry blossoms fluttered gently across the streets of Washington, D.C. as spring breathed new life into the capital. A warm breeze swept through the National Mall as Second Lady Usha Vance stepped out of the black SUV, her presence graceful and deliberate. As the wife of Vice President JD Vance, Usha had grown into her role with purpose, dedicating her platform to empowering American families and addressing mental health and economic inequality. That morning, she was set to speak at a women's leadership conference being hosted in a local community center near Capitol Hill. Her speech would focus on second chances, forgiveness, and the power of community, a theme close to her heart. As her security detail surrounded her, Usha paused and took a long look at the line of people along the adjacent sidewalk, men and women waiting patiently for free meals provided by a mobile kitchen truck. Her eyes scanned the crowd with compassion. Then she stopped. There, sitting on the curb with a paper cup half filled with coins, was a woman whose face sparked an unfamiliar but intense sense of recognition. Her clothes were tattered and mismatched, her hair pulled into a messy bun, and her hands shaking slightly as she clutched a worn leather purse. But her eyes, those weary, deep-set eyes, were unmistakable. Usha took a few steps closer, leaving her security behind for a moment, staring at the woman with disbelief. "Amy?" she whispered. The woman looked up. Time seemed to freeze. Amy Wilkins had once been J.D. Vance's trusted secretary during his early years as a rising political figure. Sharp, reliable, and always on time, Amy had been more than just a staffer, she had been like family. She had disappeared from the public eye quietly 3 years ago, and Usha hadn't thought much of it since. Political life moved fast. Now here she was, dirty, disoriented, and hunched in a spot no one should ever call home. Amy's eyes lit with shock and embarrassment. "Mrs. Vance?" she asked, voice trembling, almost inaudible. Usha didn't answer right away. She knelt beside her and touched her shoulder gently. "Amy, what happened?" Amy began to cry. She tried to speak, but her lips quivered, unable to form coherent words. After a few attempts, she simply bowed her head and shook it, her tears soaking the edge of her coat. Usha turned to her security detail and motioned them over. "We're helping her," she said firmly. "Right now." Her detail hesitated, exchanging quick glances. "Ma'am, your schedule, cancel it. This is more important." Usha helped Amy to her feet, wrapping her coat around her shoulders. The former secretary leaned into her, overwhelmed by the surreal moment of being recognized and rescued by the Second Lady of the United States. Back inside the SUV, Usha quietly handed Amy a bottle of water and a granola bar from her bag. Amy gulped the water as though she hadn't tasted clean water in days. "I'll get you a place to rest tonight," Usha said softly. "But more than that, I want to know your story. All of it. You mattered to us once, and you still matter now." Amy's hands shook as she held the water bottle, and she looked out the tinted window with a distant, broken gaze. "You're the first person," she said, barely audible, "who's seen me in 3 years." Usha Vance watched silently as Amy slept soundly in the guest room of the Vice President's residence. The sheets were freshly changed, and a warm meal had eased some of the shadows etched into her former assistant's face. Amy looked fragile, yet beneath that worn-out exterior, Usha could still see the resilience she once admired. That night, as JD returned home from a press meeting with President Trump, he found Usha sitting quietly in the kitchen with a cup of tea. Her brow furrowed. "You're not gonna believe who I found today," she began. JD poured himself some coffee and sat down across from her, tired but attentive. "Amy Wilkins. Your former secretary." JD's eyes widened. "Amy?" "She vanished. The staff said she just left one day without notice." "She's homeless," JD, Usha said. "I found her sitting on the street outside a food truck." He leaned back, stunned. "That doesn't make sense. She was so capable. Professional. What happened?" "I don't know," Usha said, her voice tinged with guilt. "But I plan to find out." The next morning, Amy emerged from the guest room slowly. Usha had laid out clean clothes, and a hot breakfast was waiting on the kitchen table. She hesitated at the doorway, clearly feeling out of place. "I'm not supposed to be here," she said quietly. "Nonsense," Usha replied, pulling out a chair. "You are exactly where you need to be. Sit, eat, then talk. I want to know what happened." Amy sat down, her fingers nervously twisting the edge of her napkin. After a long silence, she began. "I had to leave the job suddenly," she said. "My sister was dying of cancer in Ohio. I didn't tell anyone. I didn't want pity or complications. I thought I'd take a short leave and come back. But by the time she passed, I had no job, no savings, and no place to stay." JD had offered her an assistantship in the early stages of his campaign and considered her one of his most trustworthy aides. She had once managed tight schedules, high-profile donors, and even crisis PR statements. But after her sister's death, Amy fell into a spiral of grief, debt, and bad luck. Her small apartment was taken back by the landlord when she missed 3 months' rent. Then her car was repossessed. And just like that, she was on the streets. I applied for jobs, she continued. But who wants to hire someone who's been off the radar for a year? Especially someone with no fixed address. Usha listened, hands clasped in front of her. Amy's story wasn't unique, but it was unjust. A woman who had once worked in the West Wing, who had handled sensitive national matters, was now invisible to the same system she'd once helped run. I even reached out to people I knew, Amy whispered. But no one remembered me. Not really. I was just a staffer. Disposable. Usha reached across the table and took her hand. You are not disposable, Amy. You're not invisible to me. And I promise you, we're going to do something about this. Amy looked away, eyes misty. Why do you care so much? Usha's voice grew firmer. Because this is the problem with Washington. We're so busy talking policy that we forget about the people next to us. That ends with me. Later that day, Usha made calls to several trusted aides and allies. She contacted a nonprofit that focused on transitional housing and career reintegration for women. Then she called a journalist she trusted from the Federal Post. We need to tell her story, Usha said. Not for headlines, but for change. Her team was stunned. Ma'am, going public with this could raise questions. Why didn't we help sooner? How did someone so close to the administration end up homeless? Exactly, Usha said with conviction. Let those questions be asked. Maybe it's time we all start answering them. The next week was a whirlwind. Usha Vance's bold decision to go public with Amy Wilkins' story sent shockwaves through Washington and beyond. When the Federal Post published the headline, Second Lady Usha Vance brings former White House aide back from the streets, the story exploded across digital media and cable news. Photos of Usha standing beside a now showered and clean Amy circulated everywhere. The article dove deep into Amy's fall from grace, not because of any crime or scandal, but because of something far more common and damning. A system that forgot her. In a heartfelt televised interview aired on News Nation. Usha sat beside Amy and shared what led to their reunion. I couldn't look away, Usha told the host. Not when someone who helped our family, our country, was sitting on a street corner, forgotten. That's not the America we claim to be. Amy, her voice fragile but steady, added, I never thought I'd be homeless. I followed every rule. Got my degree. Worked long hours. Served my government. But one personal crisis and I was gone just like that. The interview struck a nerve. Calls flooded the Vice President's office. Letters poured in from across the country, many from women who had similar stories. A retired teacher from Texas. A single mother in Ohio. A former military admin from Georgia. They all shared one refrain, I thought no one cared. In the days that followed, something extraordinary happened. A bipartisan group of senators led by JD Vance himself proposed a new piece of legislation called the Dignity Act, aimed at addressing homelessness among former government workers, veterans, and caregivers. The bill proposed tax credits for companies that hire people transitioning out of homelessness, improved access to emergency housing, and a government-staffed hotline specifically for displaced former federal employees. The political implications were enormous. Progressives praised the move for its compassion. Conservatives hailed it as a faith and family issue finally getting attention. And the media couldn't ignore the human story that had sparked it all, but not everyone was thrilled. Behind closed doors, several longtime political operatives warned Usha about weaponizing empathy. Ma'am, one aide whispered nervously, you've made yourself vulnerable. What if the media digs up other stories? What if it becomes a circus? Usha didn't flinch. Let it, she replied. If a circus is what it takes to make Washington care, then I'll be the first to step into the ring. Meanwhile, Amy's transformation was well underway. Thanks to private donations and help from a transitional housing nonprofit that Usha personally partnered with, Amy was set up in a small furnished apartment in Arlington. Usha assigned her a mentor from her own office, an intern named Dana who had grown up in a low-income neighborhood and knew what resilience looked like. Amy also started therapy paid for by Usha and JD themselves. For the first time in years, she was finally speaking to someone about the loss of her sister, her spiral into poverty, and the trauma of being unseen. It wasn't just healing. It was hope. One afternoon, as Usha visited the apartment, she found Amy sitting on her small balcony, sipping tea and journaling. I'm not the same woman who sat on that curb, Amy said, without looking up. But I'm not ashamed of her either. Usha smiled. You shouldn't be. She survived what most people wouldn't. There was a long pause. Then Amy looked up, her voice resolute. I want to help others like me. I want to use my voice. If people will listen. I'll speak. Usha nodded. Then we'll make sure they hear you. 3 weeks after the Federal Post story broke, Amy Wilkins stood behind a podium at the Ronald Reagan Building in Washington, D.C., addressing a crowd of more than 500 people during the inaugural Second Chances Summit. Hosted by the Second Lady herself, wearing a modest navy blue dress and a silver pin that Usha had given her shaped like a phoenix rising, Amy appeared calm and confident even as her hands trembled behind the podium. I'm here today, Amy began. Not as a victim, but as a warning and as a symbol. If it could happen to me, it can happen to anyone. The audience, filled with journalists, policymakers, activists, and even a few skeptical political figures, grew silent. I wasn't a drug addict. I didn't commit any crime. I was a White House aide. I had access to the country's most powerful rooms. But the moment my life took a turn, I became invisible. The streets don't care about your resume. She paused, letting the words settle. I didn't need a handout. I needed a hand up. And Usha Vance gave me one. Usha watched from the front row, pride welling in her chest. JD, seated beside her, leaned in and whispered, "She's incredible." She always was, Usha whispered back. People just forgot. In the following days, Amy's speech went viral. Clips aired on Fox News, CNN, and even The Daily Show, prompting unexpected conversations across political lines. Late-night hosts praised Usha for bringing humanity back into politics. Conservative influencers hailed the initiative as faith in action, while progressive circles acknowledged the surprising sincerity behind the Trump administration's handling of the issue. But the real momentum came from the grassroots. Churches began opening their fellowship halls as temporary shelters for homeless women. Startups launched hiring initiatives for displaced workers. And in cities like Indianapolis, Birmingham, and Cleveland, Amy's Circle support groups began forming, led by former homeless women inspired by Amy's bravery. Meanwhile, Usha's office quietly funded the creation of a digital resource hub called Bridgeback, offering resume tools, housing leads, therapy referrals, and mentor matching for former federal employees or women facing sudden crises. Every piece of it was personal. It was Amy's experience, documented in painful detail, that had become the blueprint for reform. One afternoon, as Usha and Amy walked through Lafayette Park on their way to a roundtable meeting, a young woman in a hoodie approached cautiously. "Excuse me," she said nervously. Are you Amy Wilkins?" Amy hesitated. "Yes." The young woman's eyes welled up. "I saw your story. I was living in my car in Baltimore. I thought it was over. But after I watched you, I called the hotline from Bridgeback. I just got a job interview. My first one in 6 months." Amy's hand instinctively reached for the woman's. "I'm so glad you did," she said softly. As the woman walked away, Usha turned to her friend, eyes glassy. "That's the America I want," Usha said, "where no one's pain is wasted." Later that evening, back at the Vice President's residence, JD entered the kitchen where Usha was sipping a cup of chamomile tea and reading a stack of handwritten letters from across the country. He leaned against the counter, arms crossed. "You know, the president called me today. Said he wants to highlight your initiative during the next State of the Union." Usha raised an eyebrow. "Donald Trump is going to talk about homeless women and second chances?" JD grinned. "Apparently you made it politically popular." She laughed. "Well, if compassion becomes a trend in Washington, I'll gladly take the credit." JD stepped forward, kissed her on the forehead. "You're changing lives, Usha. And you're changing the game." But not everyone was on board. A shadowy pack had begun running attack ads calling Usha's initiative emotional liberalism masquerading as conservative values. Social media buzzed with trolls accusing her of virtue signaling. Usha didn't flinch. She stood firm at every press briefing, at every public event. "If caring for the forgotten is considered controversial," she said once, "then let me be controversial every single day." And every day, Amy stood taller beside her. 6 months later, the East Room of the White House glowed with golden light as President Donald Trump prepared to sign into law the Dignity Act. The bipartisan legislation inspired by Amy Wilkins' story and Usha Vance's relentless advocacy. Standing beside him were Vice President JD Vance, Second Lady Usha Vance, and Amy herself, now serving as the official director of Bridgeback, the nationwide recovery and reintegration network for displaced professionals. Cameras flashed. Reporters scribbled. The president leaned into the microphone and spoke with an unusual solemnity. "America doesn't just lead with power. We lead with heart. And today we prove that even in the halls of government, no citizen should ever be forgotten. This law is for the people like Amy." A standing ovation followed. Even critics had to admit it was a rare moment of genuine unity in Washington. As the ceremony ended, Amy stepped away to a quiet corner near the French doors overlooking the south lawn. The breeze carried the scent of early spring magnolias. Usha joined her, holding 2 glasses of sparkling cider. "I never thought I'd be back in this building," Amy said quietly. "Much less in this way." Usha clinked her glass gently against hers. "You didn't come back. You rose. You rewrote your story." Amy looked at her with a knowing smile. "You helped me hold the pen." Usha shrugged modestly. "I just reminded you that your hand was still steady." That evening, the 2 women attended a private dinner hosted at the Vice President's residence. Leaders from both parties, nonprofit executives, and even skeptics turned allies gathered around the long mahogany table to toast what they now referred to as the dignity movement. Amy, seated at the head of the table beside JD, shared a personal reflection. "6 months ago, I had no address. Today, I oversee a program that helps others find theirs. But more than that, I found my worth again. And I learned that it only takes one person to believe in you for the world to start listening." Usha wiped a tear from her cheek. Across the table, JD tapped his glass. "To Amy," he declared. "And to Usha for teaching all of us that policy begins with people." Over the following months, Bridgeback expanded into 20 states. Usha helped negotiate private sector partnerships with corporations who pledged to hire those coming out of homelessness. Faith groups and charities joined hands. Even Hollywood took notice. Plans began forming for a limited TV series based on Amy's journey, and while Usha remained deeply engaged in policy, she also launched a podcast titled Second Lady, Second Chances, where she interviewed formerly displaced Americans who had made stunning comebacks. The show became a national hit. It wasn't just policy anymore, it was a movement point. One Saturday afternoon, Usha and Amy visited a new shelter in Columbus, Ohio, named Amy's Haven. The building, once an abandoned church, had been transformed into a warm, inviting center for women in crisis. Volunteers bustled, kids played in a small garden courtyard, and counselors hosted workshops inside refurbished Sunday school rooms. As they toured the facility, a small girl, barely 6 years old, ran up and hugged Amy's leg. "Are you the lady from the computer?" she asked. Amy knelt, smiling. "Maybe." "What did the lady say?" The girl giggled. "She said it's never too late to start over." Amy's eyes softened. "Then yes, that was me." Back in DC, critics continued to grumble. They called it political theater, a distraction, a fluke. But Usha knew better. The impact was undeniable. She had taken one woman's forgotten story and turned it into a fire that refused to be ignored. During a national interview with CBS Sunday Morning, Usha said something that would later be etched into plaques, murals, and speeches across the country. "America doesn't rise through strength alone. We rise every time we lift someone from the shadows and remind them they were never meant to stay there." That quote, and the woman who spoke it, would go on to change the way the nation talked about homelessness, dignity, and redemption. 2 years later, at a university graduation in Indiana, Amy Wilkins gave the keynote address to a hall of young women studying public service and social work. Her voice was strong, her message unwavering. "Don't wait for permission to change the world," she said. "And if you ever find yourself in the dark, remember, sometimes the most powerful light comes from someone simply saying, 'I see you.'" Usha sat in the front row, a proud smile on her face, because she had seen Amy, and because of that, a nation had too.